Listen to the voices of the advocates.
This week, we look to the Middle East, where we are joined by Diana Buttu, a Canadian-Palestinian lawyer currently residing in Palestine. Diana Buttu's work encompasses Palestinian issues, and she is known for being a legal advisor in the Negotiation Support Unit of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Diana Buttu shares with us her experience on the back of negotiations with Israel, the challenges she's faced dealing with the Israeli courts, and a look into present legal battles in Palestine.
Good morning, Ms. Buttu. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ms. Buttu, you are the first advocate we will be interviewing that comes from the Middle East.
Oh,
Yeah,
what an honor.
we've gotten advocates from Asia, from North America, from England, South Africa, but you are the first from the Middle East. And you are in a very hot area of the Middle East as well. And we shall get into that. But before that, I read that you are actually Canadian, but now you work, but now you have Israeli citizenship. Could you just tell our listeners how that came about?
Yes, both of my parents are Palestinian, but they're Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel. And what that means is that in the aftermath of 1948, the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, there were approximately 150,000 Palestinians who remained in what became Israel. Two of those 150,000 were my parents. Both of them were born before the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, those 150,000 ended up acquiring Israeli citizenship, and so my parents also have Israeli citizenship. And according to Israeli laws, that citizenship extends to one generation. So it extends to me and to my siblings. Plus, it extends to any of the Palestinians who were born in the country as well. So by virtue of the fact that my parents both hold Israeli citizenship, I ended up acquiring it, not later on in life. I acquired it at birth. So it was something that I acquired through my parents at birth. That said, I was actually born in Canada. My parents left Israel in 1967, just before the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip began. They were living in the city of Nazareth, which is inside of Israel. But they were living within a system of military rule, very much like what exists now in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And so what that meant was that they needed different Israeli permissions to be able to do anything, from to be able to get a job, to be able to travel, to leave their city, to go to, visit other cities such as Haifa, etc. So my parents decided that they didn't want to live under that system any longer, and they immigrated to Canada, which is why I and my other sisters ended up being born in Canada.
You grew up in Canada, schooled there, and from what I read, again, you did well in school. You went to university and all that. What made this sudden turn to go back to the West Bank, to Israel then?
That's a really great question. There's moments in your life where you see things and they impact you. And what I say about living here is that once you see, you cannot unsee. You can't shut your eyes after you've seen what you see here. And so at the time, I was very young. I was living in Canada, and I came here over the Christmas break in the winter of 1987. And at the time, the first Palestinian uprising was beginning. It had just begun, in fact, and I saw images that to this day I can't unsee. Everything from children going out in the streets to protest their lack of freedom. Everything from soldiers, Israeli soldiers, shooting at Palestinian kids, and especially when they weren't ever at threat. I saw it later became that things like Itzhak Rabin, who later became Israel's prime minister. He instituted a policy of breaking bones, in which any person who was caught throwing stones at an Israeli soldier could have their arms and their legs broken by the army with impunity. And I mean, these were the images that really seared in my mind. And I became very moved. And I was young at the time. And I remember at the time I wanted to become a doctor. And then saying to myself, that's it, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I want to stop what Israel is doing to these young kids. And these were kids who were my age and younger, and just having to face an Israeli army every day, to be able to go to school, to be able to go to the playground, to be able to get books from the library. I mean, just the normal things that you, me, and everybody else around the world does. These kids were being barred from doing. And so for me, that moment, the first Intifada and the images of the first Intifada were really what ended up leaving an indelible impression in my mind and making me want to spend more time on the cause of Palestine. So it was then that I decided that I was going to read everything I could possibly read on it. I was going to learn Arabic, which I did, and eventually end up moving here, which I did some 13 years later.
In the winter of 1987, you were have been 16 and 17, and you saw this on television, I presume. Right.
And live. I was here. I'd come for a visit here, and had also seen it here. So it wasn't just television. It was also seeing what it was. Seeing, like, just the image of seeing soldiers chasing after kids and shooting after kids. It's something that doesn't leave you. It doesn't leave you.
That's right. I mean, particularly those iconic images of you
Yes.
throwing rocks at tanks.
Yes.
Right. Right. Was this a major factor in you ultimately doing a degree in Middle East and Islamic Studies at University of Toronto, and later specifically taking up law?
Absolutely. It was at the time I was really thinking about going into medicine or something in the sciences. And it was that winter of 1987 that changed my entire trajectory of life. I'd never thought of learning Arabic. In fact, I'd resisted it as a child. I didn't want to learn Arabic. I was more interested in learning French. I had resisted learning about the Nakba and learning about what was going on in Palestine. For me, the Palestine and the Middle East they were so far away and so far removed from my mind. But that winter of 87 just changed things for me. It really ended up just changing the way that I thought. It changed my passion. It changed even the way that I read the newspaper and the books that I read. It had a profound impact on me.
Could I ask, for your family supportive of this, that you were moving towards activism?
Not really, no. My parents, of course, they're very supportive now. The biggest cheerleader I have in my life, or my biggest two cheerleaders, are my parents. But at the time, it's important to keep in mind my parents had left Israel because they had been facing so much discrimination. And so their fear was that if I got involved in any of the activism, that it would impact me negatively. And I think they really just wanted me to establish a career. Now, they weren't, I can't say that they stopped me from being active. They didn't. But they were always very cautious. And in particular, my father was the one who said, we left for a reason, and we wanted you to establish a decent life in Canada, and all of that can wait for a later time. So they weren't so enthusiastic about it. They didn't stop me, but they weren't so enthusiastic about it. Now, of course, it's the opposite. I think that for them, or at least I know for them, that they're very proud, and they are very proud of not just me, but all of these other generations of young people who've dedicated themselves to not just making a better place for themselves, but for their community, for the world, etc. And of course, it was a different time for them. It was a different time and a different experience for them.
If I could just ask, after you graduated with your degree in law, did you practice in Canada before going off to the West Bank?
I did, yes. I spent a few years working for a judge in Canada, and then I worked for the Canadian Ministry of Justice in their human rights section, dealing with health law issues mostly, but also in general human rights law. And then I went off to the United States, where I pursued an advanced degree in law, and then moved to the West Bank.
Right. Could you just tell our listeners how you got tapped to go eventually move to the West Bank? I mean, let's face it, you got a degree, a pretty good degree, from the University of Toronto, Queen's University. Then you had an LLM from University of Toronto as well. You went to the United States, to Stanford Law School, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
I mean, the world, to be frank, Ms. Buttu, was your oyster, and yet you chose to go back to the place where your parents left.
Correct.
Could you just tell our listeners what happened, who approached you, and all that?
It's a story that's in phases. So one thing that I didn't mention when it came to my parents and what had happened to my parents was in 1965. My father had a younger brother, his youngest brother, in fact, and his youngest brother at the time was on his way to school. And at the time, it was an Israeli holiday, a Jewish holiday, not an Israeli holiday. It was a Jewish holiday called Purim. Now, during the Jewish holiday of Purim, the people who are Jewish often dress up. It's the equivalent of the Western Halloween, but with a religious connotation, and they often get drunk. And on that particular day that my uncle was, this is well before I was born, but on that day that my uncle was walking to school, he ended up being hit by a drunk driver and was killed. And part of the story and part of the reason that my parents had decided to move to Canada was because the person who killed my uncle was never held accountable. He never served a day in prison. He was never arrested, in fact. And my parents were made to feel that this was just an accident and that they should just simply get over it. Now, how do you get over somebody killing your 14-year-old brother without ever being charged with a crime, just being told move on in your life? Plus, for my father, life became unbearable because he was unable to get a job. Again, remember, this is a time of military rule. And given that he had lost a brother, there was often the suspicion that, they wouldn't hire him because he might cause trouble. So, you add these two things up and you see the pain that my parents arrived in Canada with. Now, you're right, the world was my oyster in many ways, but there was also this sense that I felt that if the world is truly going to be an oyster for me or for others, we really have to start looking at issues of accountability. And we can't just have we can't live our heads in the sand. So for me, it's easy, and it's easy for many people to just put their head in the sand and say, this is in a faraway place, this is in a different area. What happened 20, 30 years ago, etc. In fact, at that point, more than 30 years ago. But I think that if the world is going to heal, and if we want the world to be a better place, we have to start looking at how it is that we can use the skills that we have to make the world a better place, not just to make our pockets heftier and better. And so for me, this isn't coming from a place of altruism, but coming from a place of me thinking that I have a skill, I have this ability, and I have the opportunity, and I was very grateful for it, Why not do it now? So it was really, that was kind of the thinking behind it. The way that I got tapped was that for many years, from the time of 1988, which is after I returned home from the first Intifada, all throughout the 90s, I had remained very active on the issue of Palestine. So at university, then in the aftermath when I was out of university, um, I really had stayed quite active and quite engaged in Palestine, to the point where for a few summers I'd come to visit Palestine and worked as a legal intern at one of the human rights organizations, and then worked as a legal intern at the Birzeit Law Institute. And so it was, I think, through a combination of them seeing my dedication and seeing, and I did have a lot of passion, I still do, for Palestine. Plus, I think they recognized that there were some skills that were needed, that it was the combination of those factors that led them to offer me the job. And in my own sense, thinking that this this was an opportunity that probably wasn't going to come around twice. And so that was the reason I decided to take it.
You joined from 2000 to 2005. You were a member of the Negotiation Support Unit for the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organizations. And you said you were tapped because there were some skills that you had that the unit needed. Could you just tell our listeners what were those skills actually?
Well, I had studied. I'd spent years studying international law. I was at this point fluent in Arabic, and I had spent a lot of time studying Israeli history and Israeli politics. So I had a combination of knowledge of international law, international refugee law, the language set, and I knew a great deal about Israeli society, Israeli history, and the Israeli government.
I see. And you were there 5 years.
Correct.
Was it a fruitful time for you? Did you feel that you achieved what you wanted to achieve there in the negotiation support unit?
That's such a difficult question for me to answer.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm glad you asked it. It's a difficult question because I don't know if you want to. If I don't know if your listeners know the dates or any of these sorts of things. So, like today is the 29th of September, and that day has a lot of significance for me personally, because that was the day that the second Palestinian uprising began. And it was also the day, September 29th, 2000, is when the uprising began. But it was also the day that I arrived in Palestine. And so it's been for me 21
So this is
years
your
now.
anniversary. This is your
Exactly.
anniversary then.
It's
Yes.
exactly my anniversary. And so answering the question, do I feel that it was fruitful? It is difficult because it's clouded by these memories of anniversary. So I don't regret joining. I don't regret coming to Palestine. I don't regret being here and witnessing the Intifada, even with all of its ups and downs, and how bloody it was, and how difficult it was, and how difficult it is. It changed me as a person. It made me the person I am today. So I don't regret that. Do I think that the negotiations were fruitful? Absolutely not. And so I'm stuck in this place where I feel as though the process itself was horrifying and terrible and fruitless and frustrating, and yet my so much of who I am is tied into my presence here and being here, and that part I don't regret. So I don't regret being here. I don't regret the things that I did. I don't regret I could have left. When you were talking earlier about why join, I think for me the more important question was, why didn't you leave? Because I could have. I could have left within the first weeks, and certainly within the first year. My contract was for a year. I don't regret any of that, but overall, the process of negotiations, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. It opened my eyes to the world, I'm grateful for what it taught me, but overall the process was fruitless. Yeah.
What was your job scope as a negotiator?
I was involved in every single meeting that took place between senior Israeli officials and senior Palestinian officials.
That must be exhausting, isn't it?
It was exhausting. Yeah, it was pretty exhausting. So I was not only just involved, but I was the person who was listening and transcribing, like taking down the notes and giving advice, and then going back and assessing proposals and making our own proposals, and at a certain point managing a team. It was very exhausting, and then dealing with diplomats and dealing with the media, and it was very exhausting. And again, I have to say, so I came into this quite naive. I thought that this was just a question of Israelis and Palestinians getting together into a room, signing an agreement, needing somebody to cross the T's and dot the I's, and make sure that there were no loops in anything. And I didn't realize just how little Israel was interested in actually having a peace agreement. They wanted to have negotiations, but they didn't ever want to end the occupation. And so that for me was one of the most exhausting things, was that at a certain point you have to acknowledge that you're doing nothing, like that you're serving as a fig leaf to pretend that there's negotiations happening, but in reality you're doing nothing. That for me was really difficult.
The objective of these negotiations, if I understand it correctly, was so that the Oslo Accords can be implemented.
Correct. So put it in a different language, in an easier language, it was so that Palestinians would finally be free. What is that? What do I mean by that? We live under a system of military rule. And what that means is that there isn't virtually any decision that can be made by Palestinians that doesn't involve Israeli input. I'll give you some examples. Let's say I want to import some, I don't know, some bananas from South Africa. That requires Israeli approval, and that approval doesn't happen. Let's get even more granular. Let's say I am somebody who needs cancer treatment. I need Israeli approval to get that cancer treatment,
Sorry, you need to get Israeli approval to get chemotherapy.
to get chemotherapy. This is not me because I hold Israeli citizenship, but Palestinians who live in the West Bank. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I mean, the Palestinian in the
Yes.
West Bank can't just go to the hospital and the doctor says, yeah, you need chemo and start next
Chemo,
week or something.
the chemo you can get, radiation you can't. Radiation needs Israeli approval. Why does it? This is a good. You're
Oh yeah,
asking. You're a good journalist.
why do you need?
You're an excellent journalist, and I'll tell you why. You've asked the most important question that nobody ever asks, which is why. Why do you need it? Because Israel does not allow radiation equipment into any Palestinian hospital, into the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. So you have to get Israeli approval because you need to be able to be approved to go to an Israeli hospital. So all of these things, like so micro, Israel is in your space. If you want to be able to go to Jerusalem to pray, you need Israeli approval. If you want to be able to go to Nazareth, let's say you're Christian and you want to go see the Church of the Annunciation, where Mary was told that she was pregnant with baby Jesus, you need Israeli approval for that. Let's say you are somebody who wants to build a house on your own land in the West Bank. You need Israeli approval for that. Let's say that you want to marry somebody from Malaysia, and you want to bring your spouse in. You need Israeli approval. And much of this has nothing to do with ever approaching Israeli territory. It's just even to be able to live within your own space. Let's say as a person from the West Bank wants to visit somebody from the Gaza Strip. They need Israeli approval. Do you know that we have a unique television show in which we see there are families that are in the West Bank that connect with their family members in the Gaza Strip via television only, because they have not been able to see one another in person for more than 2 decades, even though they are only 80
Wow.
kilometers apart. Yeah. This
So
is what
you had Zoom before the COVID.
we had Zoom before COVID. Here's another, see, you're so
Right.
good. So even with Zoom, in order to have 3G, the
Right.
thing that you and I and everybody around the
Yeah.
world
Take for
takes
granted.
for
Yeah.
granted, you need Israeli approval. In
Right.
fact, it's so low that in Gaza, they only have 2G. In the West Bank, they only have 3G, which they've only had for a few years. And they won't get 4G until 2022, when the rest of us are talking about 5G and potentially on and on and on. All of these things, to be able to draw water from a well, you need Israeli approval. To be able to, we don't have our own airport. We have to go to a foreign country, Jordan, to be able to travel. Every element of life that you can think of needs some form of Israeli approval. And add to that, there's the violence of Israeli settlers taking over your land with the help of the army, Israeli settlements being built on your land with the help of the army, sometimes your own physical home being taken over by Israeli settlers with the help of the army, and routine imprisonment of men, women, and children. Right now, there are over 5,000 Palestinians in an Israeli jail. Over 1,000 of them have not been charged with any crime. This is what it means to live under Israeli occupation. So the point of these negotiations was to end this system and to allow Palestinians to have their own free state.
So the objective of these negotiations is actually to allow Palestinians, or rather, I suppose, the Palestinian Authority, the authority to do all this without, or rather, for ordinary Palestinians to do what you just described without
Yes.
getting approval from Israel. So you had to
Absolutely.
negotiate for this.
Yes, and it got so bad, Razan. It got so bad that even, I mean, I could tell you stories. As I mentioned, I have Israeli citizenship by birth. So, in the West Bank, you have to navigate hundreds of roadblocks and military checkpoints. And at these military checkpoints, the only people who are allowed to pass are people who have an Israeli permit or Israeli citizens. And so I can tell you story after story of us being on our way to go to a negotiation with the prime minister of the country and being stopped at an Israeli checkpoint and being turned back because the Palestinian negotiator was not issued a permit by the Israeli government.
So can I ask? I mean, Ms. Buttu, you're a lawyer, right? You
Yes.
had all your qualifications at that time already. So is there what you learned as a lawyer, was it relevant in all these negotiations? What's all the skills that you learned at Stanford, at Queen's University?
No, they weren't relevant. I thought they would be, and
Yeah,
the people who hired me thought that they would be.
yeah, I would think so
Obviously.
too, but it's not really.
But no, because we never got down to the nitty gritty of law. It was always about power, and so I learned a lot about power and about
Right.
influence and about the power of media. For example, at one negotiation session, I remember we were looking at this very large map of the West Bank. The West Bank looks, for your listeners who may not be following this minute by minute, the West Bank it looks like a kidney shaped. It's a kidney shaped space of territory. And one of the Israeli negotiators had drawn a line into the thick part of the kidney shape, and said, "We're going to take all of this territory." And I said, "You're a lawyer. On what basis of international law are you seeking this border modification? Like, why is this yours? Why are you doing this?" And he giggled, he laughed, and he said, like, he didn't giggle, he chuckled, and he said, ha, he said, Diana, we will respect the law when we will be forced to respect the law. We will, and until that time, it's just you and me in a room. And
That's what you mean by
that's
power.
This is what I mean by power. So, going back to what I was mentioning earlier about accountability, here we are in a system. This occupation has now gone on since 1967. It's in its 54th year, and there's no accountability, and there's no rule of law. There's no system of laws. None of that is in place. So you can have the best lawyers in the world on this case, but until we begin to hold Israel accountable, the law means nothing. And so therefore my skills meant nothing. A lot of it was really just, I learned a lot about power and the impact of power.
So, Ms. Buttu, you now teach a course at Harvard University called
Yes.
Negotiation Skills, Strategies for Increased Effectiveness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if you could take maybe 3 points from your course and apply it to the negotiations that you underwent from 2000 to 2005 with the Israelis, would that be of any help, you think?
No, not at all. The course that I teach is very much on how to become a much more effective negotiator, which are skills that I learned through, I didn't mention this, but when I was at Stanford, I was at the Stanford Center for Conflict Resolution and Negotiation. When I was at Queen's, one of the prizes that I had received was on negotiations and mediation. So I am a trained negotiator mediator, which also I think was one of the things that they were looking for when they hired me.
I mean, that sounds perfect, isn't it? Negotiating
Yes,
with a
absolutely,
opponent, right?
absolutely. Would my course help people? It helps people, but would it have applied to this negotiation? The answer is no, because we didn't have any negotiations. Our negotiations were mostly dictations. The first thing that I teach my students, the very first lesson on day one that I teach students is that we need negotiations when because we don't live in a world of dictatorships. And once we live in a world of dictatorships, you don't need negotiation skills, right? You need good listening skills, and that's it. And unfortunately, when it came to this, when it came to these negotiations, there were no negotiations. It was effectively a dictatorship. It was effectively them telling us, this is what's going to happen. And if not, we're going to hold a gun to your head. And effectively, I mean, they didn't literally hold a gun to my head, but they did to the heads of the Palestinian people. For every time that we went to negotiations, they made the situation on the ground worse. They tightened the checkpoints. They made sure that we weren't allowed to export. They blockaded the Gaza Strip. They made the siege on the Gaza Strip even worse. And if we said no, they tightened it even more and even more and even more. And so, for example, I lived in the Gaza Strip between the year of early 2005 until June of 2006. And I can tell you that over that period of time, this is before Hamas was elected, before there was Hamas, that every day got progressively worse, because what they were attempting to do was to extract from us concessions. They didn't want us to be demanding that we have an airport. They didn't want us to be asking for a seaport. They didn't want us to be pressuring the international community to link the West Bank and the Gaza Strip together territorially. And so what they did was they would blockade us. They would block imports. They would block exports. And they effectively said to us, you either agree to what we say, or we're going to make life worse for you. And so there was no negotiations. It was a dictatorship. It was an effective dictatorship.
Would you say then, in a negotiation, basically, even the weaker party needs to have some sort of leverage or point,
correct,
to press the stronger party, and in the situation you and your team found yourself in, there was simply no leverage to be put or pressure to be put on the Israelis. Would that be right?
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the only, you have to think of what the leverage points were. The only leverage points are to make life uncomfortable for Israelis or to make the world more aware. And to make life uncomfortable for Israelis, there's different ways. There's one of violence, which is not something that the Palestinian leadership was advocating, but it's completely understandable why it happens. And the other was to press for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement to make Israelis feel uncomfortable so that they know that they can't just simply travel around the world and do whatever it is that they want to do, that they're not going to be welcomed, their goods are not going to be welcomed around the world, that their companies are not going to be welcomed around the world, that their sports, their athletes are not going to be welcomed around the world. So that's one way. And then the other way was to focus on getting the world much more aware of, of what's happening in Palestine. And so I worked on both of those fronts. One of trying to get the world much more aware, and this is why I got so involved in media. And then the other was to really push for accountability through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement.
You spoke about leverage points. When did you realize that you didn't have any?
Again, in waves. I think the final blow came in January of 2001 at the end of the Taba negotiations. That was that negotiation where I told you the senior Israeli official said to me, we'll respect the law when we're forced to respect the law. And that's when I began to realize that like we have no leverage at all. And had been times leading up to it, but I think that was the major one, was that that became a turning point for me, and that's when I started to focus more on getting people to understand what it's like to live under occupation, what it's like to live under military rule.
Do you practice law now in Israel?
I do. Yes, I do. So I do a few things now. I mostly serve as a legal consultant, working on cases involving human rights issues. So home demolitions, confiscation of land, when the settlers are taking over houses and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be a particular flashpoint now in Israel. I mean, not particular. I mean, it's been going on for years. Settlers
Yes.
coming in, taking over Palestinian land, so on and so forth. But I do read that there will be challenges to this. People, the original owners of the land will take the settlers to court and so on and so forth. What's your experience of the Israeli court? Would an Israeli judge actually listen to this and try his or her best to apply the law? Because as I understand it, Israel has a common law tradition as well. This episode of Advocates the Podcast is supported by Taylor's Law School, where you master the skills, tactics, and ethics that these top advocates will be talking about.
Yes, that you're right. The Israeli courts are. There's a great saying in Arabic, which there isn't an English equivalent, but I'll try to give
Yeah,
the
the
English
gist of it.
equivalent, which is in Arabic it's hakmak zalmak, which is your the judge is also the person who is your oppressor. In English, it would be the judge, the jury, and the executioner all in one, and that's what it is. So the Israeli Supreme Court is made up of Israelis. It's made up of Israelis from all walks of life, including Israeli settlers. These Israeli settlers know that they are living on stolen Palestinian land and continue to live there, and yet you have a Supreme Court judge who is an Israeli settler. In addition, the courts themselves will twist themselves to try to make things look legal. But when you step back and challenge it, it's actually illegal. And I'll give you an example. In 2003, the Israeli government started a project of building this 700-kilometer wall in the West Bank. And the vast majority of this wall is actually not on the green line. It's not on the line between the West Bank and Israel. It's actually within the West Bank. So it's actually stealing Palestinian land. And there were a number of lawyers who said, well, the only thing that we can do is challenge this within an Israeli court. And they took it to the Israeli courts, and the Israeli courts systematically upheld the legality of this wall without fail. With just few exceptions, they would move it a few meters, but systematically upheld it. I, along with a team of other lawyers, decided that we weren't going to use the Israeli legal system, but instead go to a system that isn't tainted by settlers, that is going to focus on international law. And so we went to the International Court of Justice. And here we are at the International Court of Justice with a unanimous opinion that the wall is illegal and that it must be dismantled. And so you see the difference between the way that the Israeli legal system works and the international legal system works. The Israeli legal system consists of judges who are Israeli, who are benefiting from the system. Some of them are settlers who will 9 times out of 10 find in favor of the government or of the settlers. Whereas and they will twist the law to make it so that what is illegal becomes legal. Whereas if you go to any international court, you see the opposite, that the world stands very firmly by Palestinian rights, that they say that what the Israeli Supreme Court is doing is wrong, and they rule in our favor. And so working within the Israeli system is the equivalent of hitting your head against a wall. You know that you're never going to get any justice. But that's the only tool that we have now, because the international legal system because nobody's pressuring Israel. And we don't see countries around the world stepping forward and saying to Israel, if you don't stop, we're going to apply economic sanctions against you. So, we're forced to use this legal system no matter how flawed it is. And all that it does is it gives the veneer of legitimacy to the system. But we have no other choice, because at the end of the day, we're trying to buy time for many of these people so that they can stay in their house longer, in the hopes that one day the world will wake up and do something about it.
To be blunt, that sounds particularly dispiriting. It must be really, really
Absolutely.
hard.
It is.
Going to do a case in an Israeli court, knowing fully well that although the law may be in your favor, the facts may be in your favor, but you're destined to lose.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm sorry, may I ask, how do you do this? What is the mindset there, right?
Well, we have to. Look, I try to give an analogy to people so that they understand. It's like telling somebody who is desperately in need of chemotherapy, with cancer that can be treated, that we're just going to give you some aspirin and hope that it goes away. I mean, that's the equivalent of it. But the only reason that we do it is because we're hoping that we can buy some time. We're hoping that with each case that's presented before the court, that the family will be able to stay longer in their house. The village will be able to stay intact for a little bit longer, and that eventually the diplomatic track will work. That the world will step forward and say enough is enough. So I can give you an example. One of the communities that I've been working with since 2009 is a small community of, I think now it's probably about 175 people. Very small little community, and they live in the most basic of living conditions. They live in shacks. They live in tents. They are farmers. They have a lot of cattle, like goats, sheep, cows, mostly goats and sheep, and they have it's a small community. They've been on this land since 1953, since before the occupation. And the Israeli government built a settlement nearby and has been trying to kick them off of their land since the early 1990s.
Mhm.
Now, this community refuses to leave because it is their land. They've been there since the 50s. And, and the Israeli government has made it so difficult for them. They don't have running water. They don't have any electricity. They have nothing. Now, in 2009, the people from the community decided that they wanted to finally get their kids educated. They wanted to build a school in their community because the kids would have to walk normally 7 kilometers each direction on a major highway to get to and from school. So, with the help of some activists, they built a school out of tires and mud. That's the school.
Okay.
It's built out of tires and mud. I can send you pictures. You'll be amazed. And sure enough, the Israeli government came along and issued a demolition order, not just for the school, but for the entire community. And so this community has been fighting in court since 2009. Now, I can say very proudly that if there's one thing that I've done well in my life, it's that I've kept this school standing. The school it started off with grade 1 in 2009, grade 2, 2010, grade 3, 2011.
Right.
Every year it's been expanding a classroom, and the kids have managed to stay there. And some of them have even managed to finish their education, their primary education there, before going off to secondary education. Now, as I said, that's the one good thing. It's one good thing I've done in my career, in my life, is that we've kept the school standing. Now the kids know that their school is under threat of demolition, and we've been to court and we've exhausted every single legal track that is there. The school and the entire community is slated for demolition, and has been now for 3 years. And in these 3 years, the only reason that the school has stayed standing and the community has stayed standing is because we refuse to be quiet about it. And so it's that combination of, we know that it's a losing game. We know that it's a losing battle. But in the process, we've managed to finish educating all of these kids so that they at least finish their primary education, are able to go on to secondary school, if not further. And the community is still standing. Now, it's my hope that, I keep saying, I've done my end of things. I've done my share. It's now the job of the international community to make sure that this community is allowed to stand, but not just stand. They're entitled to water. They're entitled to electricity. They're entitled to be able to have the normal things in life that you and I and everybody else wants. And they're entitled to not live under the threat that their whole community is going to be demolished over their heads.
So what you do in these sort of cases, I suppose, is to file a claim. Then I suppose you go to court, get an injunction, get some sort of stay order.
Yes.
Then you just try your best to drag it long as possible.
Correct.
To allow people to stay on there, and
Correct.
in your case, in the case of the school, at least complete the education, right?
Correct. And here's the irony of it all. There's a settlement that is just a few kilometers away. You can see it from their community. It's actually built on their land. And the kids, when I go there, with the exception of this year, I haven't been able to go because of COVID. But every year we, as a community, we collect. We bring them book bags. We buy them school supplies. As a community, we are making sure that this community is allowed to stand. And I see the kids. The kids always say to me, "Are those kids up there who are living illegally, because their settlement is illegal? Is their school going to be demolished?" And of course, the answer is no, because the Israeli system has made it that what's illegal is legal and what's legal is illegal. So the illegal settlement is allowed to stand, and the community that has been there before this state was even established is under threat of demolition.
I just want to ask, you do these sort of cases, do you yourself personally feel threatened or I
Oh,
mean, I
sure.
read somewhere you've been kicked out of your house before and all
Oh,
that. Could
yeah.
you just
Oh, yeah.
tell
Oh, yeah.
our listeners, because clearly you will not be on the Christmas cards list or whatever cards
No,
list of the Israeli authorities, right?
no, no. I'm not there. No, they're definitely not inviting me to the galas.
Yes, yes. So
No,
yeah.
no, no. Yes, I have and others have as well. It's where do I begin? The
Does your phone get tapped, for instance, and all this?
Well, all of our phones are tapped. This
Okay.
is what it means to be a Palestinian in this country. We know that we're being monitored. We know our emails are monitored. We know our phones are monitored. We know our physical locations are monitored. Um, this is here's some examples. In in the in 2014 when the Israeli army was attacking the Gaza Strip, I received death threats from from people. They put up a Facebook page calling for my killing, and nobody did anything about it. Not the Israeli government, not the police, not nobody did anything about it. It took going up to the high levels within Facebook to have the Facebook page removed. Even there have been times where I've personally received death threats on my phone. My parents, when I in Canada, have received threats at our home in Canada. You're right that the army took over my house, but that was under a different circumstance in 2002. I don't think they knew that it was me at the time. At least
Mm.
I don't have any indication that they knew that it was me. But you're always under threat. Then at the airport, I've never at the airport you always feel at risk, at threat, that you're being surveilled. They know who you are at all points in time. I've been And it's not just the government. There's been times where I've been sitting on public transportation and people will recognize me and will say things. And so you're always living in a system of kind of fear, but it's become so normalized now that it's just normal. But that part of it is less than what I think other people are going through and what all of us are going through. So what all of us go through is that at any moment, any Palestinian can be killed, and the Israeli spin machine, the Hasbro, the propaganda
Mm.
machine, will turn it into uh, that they were a terrorist. For example, one of my friends, her cousin was driving through an Israeli checkpoint on his way to go pick up something for his sister's wedding. And he was in a rental car, and the car was moving very slowly, and he lost control of the car. They shot and killed him on the spot, and they shot him on the spot. The army refused to let paramedics get near him, and he bled out as people watched this man bleed for an hour and a half, and then turned him into a terrorist. It's been over a year now, and his body still hasn't been returned back to the family.
Wow.
This is what it means to be a Palestinian here. So, yes, I have specific things that are against me, Diana, the person, but the bigger issue is what all of us face and how our lives can, in an instant, be extinguished, and how, in an instant, we can be transformed into terrorists, and without anybody second guessing it or questioning it.
Ms. Buttu, just a couple of questions, and I think the first is, speaking of all these threats to your life, has anything changed, your views on this since having your son? I think you have a young son, right? Has that
Yes,
changed anything for you?
it's a lot. It's changed a lot of things. Here, for me now, um, I'm walking a very fine line of thinking whether I should be remaining here or whether I should leave. And because I want him, he's Palestinian, and I want him to know about Palestine, and I want him to know about our cause, and I want him to know about our demand for freedom, and I want him to know right from wrong. And it's very important for me, for him to understand language, history, culture, religion, like all of these things. And it's and I want him to understand our own personal history and our own language. I mean, those things are very important to me for him to understand. And yet, at the same time, I recognize that soon he's going to be a teenager, and then I mean, he's 7 now, but 14 is around the
Yes.
corner. As you may know, if you have children, he's soon going to be a teenager, and soon he's going to be a target. And that part terrifies me. And the other part that terrifies me is I want him to have every advantage in this world. And I sometimes feel like I'm putting him in every disadvantage because he's living in a system and in a country where he is unwanted because the Israelis don't want us, and in a place where so much racism and so much discrimination. So that weighs very heavily on me. The other part that weighs very heavily on me is the flip side, which is that I feel as though whatever energy I have has to go into making the world a better place, not just for him, but for his classmates and for his generation and for the generations that follow. So it's often this push-pull that I have of thinking about whether this is the right place for us or whether this is the wrong place for us. Plus, I worry about whether he knows too much or, and he's still young. So these are all things that it's always a question of how much I'm burdening him. Now, I'm very fortunate that my son is bright and he's very inquisitive and he's very passionate and very curious and very loving. And so he's seen that community, Khan al-Ahmar, the one I talked about. He's visited them many times. He has made friends with some of the kids there, and he recognizes that what's happening to them is so wrong, and he so desperately wants to help them. Um, and I'm fortunate that I have a son who's so compassionate and who sees that there's right from wrong. So on that side, it's been very rewarding, but at the same time, as I said, I worry about what the future holds for him and for others, and I'm torn between this idea of wanting to protect him from it versus wanting to take the system head on and make it better for him.
The next one I have, it's circling back to what you said earlier. I mean, negotiations 2002 to 2005, you said futile. And I think the court work now is also very, very frustrating, an uphill battle all the way. What about the international community? Because at some point you were trying to build awareness, you're trying to show them what it's like in Palestine. So how has that been working out? I mean, through your 21 years, has there been any improvements, anything, progress?
It's gone up and down. The up part has been that nobody can say any longer that they don't know what's happening here. It's now the only thing that people can say is that they don't want to know, or that there's other factors, right? Like there's other diplomatic pressures that they have, namely the power of the Israel lobby that exists in many countries, whether it's in Europe or in the United States. So that I think has been different. Whereas 21 years ago, without the internet, without social media, it was definitely a much more difficult and varied job than it is today. Today, the plus side of things is that we're seeing that young people, and not just young people, people around the world now are opening their eyes to what's happening in Palestine. They're opening their eyes to what Israel's about and what Israel's doing, and I think they're now seeing that what it's doing is wrong. There's this last bombing campaign on the Gaza Strip in May, where they flattened buildings. They literally flattened high-rise buildings. One of the ones that they flattened was a building that I once lived in. I had some very beautiful memories in. the world is now seeing that doesn't make sense, that it doesn't make sense that you're flattening the entire building for the Associated Press. And so on that front, it's been, I'm optimistic that, and I'm pleased that the world is opening their eyes, but I'm still baffled by the power that the Israel lobby has, to the point where politicians are still too afraid to say anything when they know better, because they do know better now. They do know better now, and that part scares me. When I see U.S. politician after U.S. politician make these stupid statements about Israel's security without ever once mentioning Palestinians and our needs for security and our need for rights and our need for freedom. And they don't even question that occupiers don't get to be secure. If you're a rapist, you don't get to be secure. I'm sorry, that's just not the way the world works. If you're a thief, you don't get to be secure. We don't around the world say, "Oh, that person robbed somebody's house. Oh no, they shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have been attacked for it." It's the opposite. We would always say, "Oh, they were in the process of robbing a house. Of course, the owners of the house are going to defend the house." We don't say, "Oh yeah, the attackers are really entitled to a level of security." That just doesn't exist around the world, except when it comes to Israel. And so it's baffling to me that I still hear U.S. politicians say these lines, because they're not just lines; they're lines that they practice in front of a mirror. These are statements that they have said over and over again because they think that it will get them votes. And so that part baffles me. But I think we're reaching a new tide now where people are beginning to say that saying those lines over and over again are not going to get you votes. In fact, it's going to get votes taken away from you. That's the point that I think we're reaching now.
Hopefully.
Inshallah. Yeah, I mean, inshallah. I hope
Yeah.
so too. I hope
Yeah.
so too. Yeah.
Ms. Buttu, we could carry on for another hour or 2 hours or so even. But we have come now to the last section, which is what we call the rapid fire questions. So I'm just
Oh, okay. Yeah, please.
put some questions to you, and let's see where that takes us. What did you enjoy most, teaching students, because we know you teach as well, or actually doing the advocacy work in court, despite the challenges of the Israeli system?
Yeah. There's two things I love. So I love teaching my students. I also teach a course in international human rights law, and I love teaching my students. It's a lot of fun. I really love working with media, and I love, I mean, not just me, like, sorry, let me step back. I love my students. I love teaching. I love opening people's eyes to Palestine. Like if I take people around and I show them what's going on, I really enjoy that. And in terms of advocacy, I enjoy spending time with diplomats and having them see the world through a different lens. Yeah.
Right. So who do you learn most from, actually?
My son.
Who inspired you? Your son, right?
My son.
Okay.
My son and my father. My son and my parents. Let me step back. My son has taught me to see the world through a totally different lens. 7-year-olds have a different perspective on the world than
That's
others.
right.
And my parents, because they've lived through so much, particularly my father, who lived through the Nakba, who was 9 years old at the time, and my mother, who knows how to live off of the land. And they've really taught me a lot. Yeah.
If you could go back and negotiate the peace process again, what would you change about your approach, or would you even go back?
I wouldn't go back. I think that if I were to do this over again, I would have advised that there not be negotiations any longer.
What's the most daunting task you faced as a lawyer?
I think the most difficult task that I've faced as a lawyer is trying to explain to families that the legal system doesn't work. Yeah.
Wow. And if you could go back in time, what would you say to the young Diana Buttu just out of law school?
Oh, I think I would say lead with your heart. Go and do what you want to do, because that's what I did. I did what I wanted to do, and I wouldn't change that.
So a day in the life of Diana Buttu. Say, let's take a day where have to appear in court and all that. So how would your day start? What would be the typical day be?
So I don't have many court days any longer because I'm mostly doing consulting work now.
Mm.
But a typical day without let's leave that part aside.
Right.
My day usually starts off. I have a lot of emails that I have to get through on a daily basis.
Right.
I have a lot of phone calls that I have to make on a daily basis because every day I'm trying to track what's happening, what developments are happening in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So every day I'm looking at the news, but I'm also tracking with people who are on the ground, the human rights activists and others, what is actually happening on the ground so that I know what's happening there. I spend a lot of time myself keeping notes of things that are happening. Plus, I spend a lot of time doing research. On the days that I need to teach, I spend a lot of time going over my class notes, making sure that everything is intact, and I do a lot of writing. I try to spend at least 4 hours a day doing writing.
And lastly, what do you do to relax?
It's not a lot. Clearly not enough. The things I enjoy the most are I like making puzzles with my son. I like reading to him and listening to him read to me. That's a lot of fun. I enjoy reading and I enjoy physical activity.
Right. Diana Buttu, thank you very much for appearing on Advocates, the podcast. Thank you.
It's my pleasure, and you've been a wonderful, two wonderful hosts. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Advocates, the podcast. If you like this episode, be sure to follow us on all our social media channels. Leave a review or share this episode and tag us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.